nos invités se joindre au webinaire. All right, welcome everybody, bienvenue à ce premier webinaire alimenté de la réflexion de l'année de l'ISSP. It's not the end of January yet, so I will take the liberty to wish everybody Happy New Year. Still a couple more days to, I think, be able to do that. We're just delighted to have this first Food for Thought session of the year. We'll begin with the Indigenous affirmation of the University of Ottawa. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So for those who don't know me, my name is Monica Gattinger. I'm director of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. If this is your first event with us, welcome. The ISSP is a cross-faculty research institute at the University of Ottawa that explores the links across and between science, society, and policy. This event will be taking place in English, mais si jamais vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez surtout pas à poser des questions en français. On va certainement pouvoir vous répondre et vous pouvez vous exprimer dans la langue de votre choix. The ISSP's strategic vision for the next 5 years is to help Canada transform decision-making for the grand challenges of our time. And for us, this means trying to help Canada to strengthen and foster deeper, stronger relationships among academia, government, business, Indigenous communities and organizations, and civil society. We have 3 key areas of emphasis in terms of our research, teaching, and engagement for this next number of years. The first is public trust in expertise and expert-based decision-making. The second focuses in on co-production of policies by business, government, academia, civil society, and Indigenous partners. And the third is weaving together technological, social, and policy innovations. I'm really excited about our Food for Thought for today, as it touches on all 3 of these areas, in particular questions around public trust and expertise and expert-based decision-making. We're delighted to have with us our core member, Professor Jeremy Kerr, who will be addressing the question of science advice when evidence is politicized, a very challenging topic, and one that we're really keen to hear from him on. Professor Kerr has been very active in this area, both as scholar and as a practitioner. Jeremy and I were talking about exactly this question the other day, and he commented to me that this is the question to which we all must be putting our energies. So I'm really looking forward to his remarks. We're also very fortunate to have with us a tremendous moderator for this event, ISSP Senior Fellow, Margaret McQuaig Johnston. I can't think of a better moderator for this session, and so glad that Margaret can join us today. Margaret, in addition to being Senior Fellow with us, is also Senior Fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Ottawa, as well as a board member of the Canadian International Council and an advisory board member of the Canada-China Forum. She's also a member of the Canada Committee and the Canadian Board of Human Rights Watch. Margaret has many, many accolades behind her name and has done a tremendous amount of research, speaking, and engagement around questions of China. She is an advisory board member of the forthcoming China Risks Institute, as well as a policy advisor to the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project. In addition to those very exceptional accolades and affiliations, I think what Margaret brings today that's really relevant is that she spent almost 40 years in the Canadian Federal Public Service in science and technology policy, in programs, and in funding. She served at the Assistant Deputy Minister level at the Department of Finance, at Natural Resources Canada, and her final posting prior to retiring from the Federal Public Service was as Executive Vice President of the Natural Sciences and Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. So Margaret really brings, I think, a lot of value to our discussion today in terms of practical experience with some of the issues that Jeremy is going to be speaking to. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Margaret, who will be moderating our session for today. And the session will close with a brief sneak peek at what we're going to be having on our Food for Thought agenda at our next session in February from our Communications and Outreach Specialist, Genevieve Dunn. So without further ado, Margaret, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Monica, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to moderate this event today, the first Food for Thought event of 2023, and particularly as I realize that it's almost 10 years since I joined the ISSP after my retirement from government. Over the decades, I have had the privilege of working with some of Canada's most dedicated public servants in science and technology policy, programs, and funding, some of whom are watching this event today. At ISSP, I've been writing about China's innovation system and human rights infringements in that country. Our speaker today is Professor Jeremy Kerr of the University of Ottawa, a leader in environmental science, not only in Canada, but internationally, with his discoveries achieving global profile in the media, reaching an audience of hundreds of millions of people. He is an elected fellow of AAAS. His discipline is biology, and he holds the University Research Chair in Macroecology and Conservation. Dr. Kerr's many scientific passions include how environmental change affects biodiversity, how climate change has affected species survival, and the development of policies on equity, diversity, and inclusion in research. He is an executive member of NSERC Council and chair of NSERC's Committee on Discovery Research. Dr. Kerr's scientific achievements have won him many awards, such as the university's Young Researcher of the Year, Ontario's Early Researcher Award, and Science Ambassador for Partners in Research. For those of us in the science policy field, Dr. Kerr is a distinguished activist as well as a practitioner who has had key roles in shaping Canada's science policy landscape in both government and political backrooms. He has also testified before parliamentary committees on scientific issues and science policy challenges. Our topic today is science advice when evidence is politicized, creating a challenge for scientific research integrity. If scientific facts have been warped or ignored, as we've seen during the pandemic, this will fundamentally affect policies for Canadians, not only in health, but also in environment and other fields. This was a top issue more than 10 years ago, which resulted in the creation of the independent organization Evidence for Democracy, and eventually the resurrection of the Minister of Science role and the Office of the Chief Scientist, in all of which Dr. Kerr has been involved as an advocate and an advisor. Dr. Kerr will speak for about half an hour, and then we will take questions from those attending. So you can put your questions in the Q&A. Dr. Kerr, over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's just such a pleasure to be able to speak with everybody today. I will start by attempting to share my screen, and let's see how I go. I'm sure this is going to work. Looks like that is more or less on track. So I have really a lot to talk about today, and of course the issues that I'm going to be discussing are far too expansive for me to possibly get through them in half an hour or any amount of question and answer period that might follow. But I would like to take a few moments as I begin this talk to identify some of the key themes that have concerned me deeply in the context of scientific integrity. So here's a general gist of what I'm going to talk about. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy for the opportunity to be here today, because it's just such a pleasure to be among so many distinguished people and to meet colleagues old and new in this context. I'd like to start by simply saying what scientific integrity is. We don't always clearly describe this, and what that means is that sometimes we are at cross purposes when we discuss the issue. I'd also like to discuss how scientific integrity impinges upon the activities of scientists in the context of their work at the interface between their research and society. There are many ways in which scientists engage with society and with policy, but unless we recognize that there are different levels of that engagement and that different levels of engagement create different risks for scientific integrity, then I think we are not fully recognizing the nature of these challenges. Finally, I'd like to give a couple of examples, or at least one example in particular, which summarizes some of the ways in which environmental legislation in the past has come under attack in a way that is inextricably tied to attacks on scientific integrity, and some of the work that had to take place to try to rescue what remained of environmental legislation by about 2015, and then a few lessons for looking forward. Scientific integrity. This is, I think there are probably several possible definitions for something like this, but the one that I'm going to be using today has a couple of different parts to it that are important and that I would like particularly to emphasize for everybody. What I'm going to say is that scientific integrity is the capacity to collect, use, and communicate thorough scientific evidence without suppression, misdirection, or other interference. I'm going to take this definition and I'm going to divide it in two. The first part of the definition is on the scientist's side, the capacity to collect, use, and communicate thorough scientific evidence. The thorough part is really important because it implies responsibility. A scientist who is not doing those things, collecting, using, communicating, in a thorough way that is accounting for the full breadth of scientific information, is not actually holding up their end of the bargain in terms of scientific integrity. So scientific integrity is not all on somebody else to make sure they stay out of our way as scientists. We also have a key role in terms of living up to everybody else's, to societal expectations. But of course, in the last 15 or 20 years, we have seen plenty of examples in Western democracies where scientific information has been suppressed, sometimes even altered. It has been misdirected, or it has been interfered with in various ways, just hidden or prevented from being communicated in some public way. And that obviously is not usually on the science side, that's usually on the policymaker or decision maker side. Increasingly, however, it should be noted, it can be in the general public, and attempts to shout down evidence sources in public discussions have become all too common and are no longer restricted to the political classes. What I want to try to do is quickly summarize my perspective on scientific integrity, but to put that definition in the context of ways in which scientists have sometimes chosen to engage with society and with policy. And I'm going to identify three different broad categories of engagement that present different levels of risk to scientific integrity. The first of these is very simply evidence-based activism, and I mean based activism. So for a scientist, this means beginning with your best understanding of the evidence that helps you identify the boundaries of the playing field within which policy has to operate. So what science can do in a context like this, and this is not the exclusive value of science in these situations. But what science does is it says, okay, you've got to take account of these facts if you actually want to implement a policy that solves a problem. A classic example of this is from the 1980s, and a few of us are old enough to remember that time, with the extremely important work that the Mulroney government did on addressing acid precipitation. There were two broad camps at the time. On one side, folks really wanted governments to step in and just regulate everything, really require that industries conform to a kind of top-down set of rules and regulations. On the other extreme, and I'm simplifying a little bit for purposes of making a brief discussion, there was a market-based approach, which at the time would have been viewed as a very right-wing kind of thing to do. And in the end, both in the United States and in Canada, this is the approach that was used. Now, underlying all of this, the reason why this is an illustrative example is that science created the playing field within which those policies could compete. But the key thing was science could identify what had to happen. What didn't matter from a science point of view at the time was how it happened. So we needed to get certain sorts of emissions under control. And whatever mechanism we chose doesn't really matter whether it's a right-wing mechanism or a left-wing mechanism, as long as we ended up all playing on the same field, we could make progress. So something that is really important here is that although there were a great many scientists who were involved with this work, the policies were in no way self-evident by virtue of knowing the science. And this is something that I think scientists need to ensure they keep in mind, that, you know, by virtue of being experts on something doesn't make you experts on other things. And policymakers often have really clever mechanisms to implement solutions to problems, and scientists need to be listening as much as they are speaking, if not more, especially in this context. You'll notice the bird pictures here are going to get a little more aggressive as we get toward riskier views, riskier approaches to engagement by scientists with society and with policy. The second of these I'm going to call evidence-informed activism, and I mean very specifically informed rather than based. This is being aware of at least some of the evidence, but letting other considerations like personal ethical views, public pressure, your Twitter followers, alter your public advice. Evidence-informed activism or evidence-informed work is the natural realm for policymakers because they have to work with evidence and perspectives that come from many different angles, some of which are what we would classify traditionally as hard evidence, and others of which are about people and how people's views interact with those facts in society. Some scientists work in this space and don't realize it. This is a problem because then there is the potential for, if we're optimistic about things, unwitting dishonesty. If advice that scientists give is colored by what are purely subjective views, that is, the advice they're giving is not sufficiently thorough. So this is an area where I would say there is a risk to integrity. But the next one, and this is a very aggressive bird picture, even if it's not entirely obvious to the non-bird community out there, but pure activism is a problem for scientific integrity. And this is where you just don't have scientific integrity when this is what you're doing. This is advocacy based on personal beliefs, social cues, again, Twitter think, which is actually more problematic and would be worth another presentation perhaps sometime. This is where evidence is actually optional, sometimes even antithetical to engagement. There are lots of examples of pure activism, some of the most pernicious things that we have seen in society over the last generation. We could certainly talk about anti-vaccination views and the kind of vacuum of evidence that's associated with that. But the ones that are more personal to me over a longer period are things like climate change denial. This is just utterly incompatible with any sensible view of evidence, or people who argue that pesticides should never be used again or under any circumstance. And that's a highly selective view of what the total amount of evidence actually says. This is a problem because it is fundamentally dishonest. A scientist who engages in pure activism and uses their stage as a scientist to advocate without making clear that they are not speaking purely as a scientist is essentially lying in public. And this happens all the time, including in my own community in ecology and evolution. But let me say, the boundaries between each of those three categories of risk for science integrity are all gray. These are not, you're doing A or you're doing B or you're doing C. You can be doing a little bit of A and a lot of B and so on. There are gray spaces between these things. The boundaries are not hard. And scientists are people too. This is important, and sometimes historically scientists haven't been really sure if they're people too. We have the right to personal views and to communicate them just as anyone else does in society. But the thing that's really important in this is that honest signaling is vital. If we as scientists stand up in public and we are commenting as a scientist, the nature of those comments need to follow different rules than public commentary as a citizen. That is, we need to honestly signal what we are actually doing. And sometimes, that requires a little bit more self-reflection than traditionally happens before people speak in public. The ultimate issue here is one that I think was nicely summarized in a line from a song by one of my favorite bands, the Lumineers. They were here in February of 2020, and it was the last big concert that happened in the city of Ottawa before the whole world just kind of pushed that very terrible pandemic pause button. But the line is, because it's a long road to wisdom, but it's a short one to being ignored. And this is basically just to say credibility is hard won and easy to lose. The caveat to this, or the kind of sub rule to that, is that credibility once lost is much harder to get back a second time. And that's something that scientists had best keep closely in mind as they contemplate engagement with society. But with a few simple rules, I think that engagement can be safe and very powerful, indeed vital, to understanding how science affects policy and how science can make a difference. So what I want to try to do is talk about one of the examples. There's a long series of these that we could go through, but one of the examples where scientists in Canada got together in a very strong and even nuanced way, which is also unusual for scientists, to engage with policymakers. This is in defense of the Species at Risk Act. Between about 2011 and 2014, there was a lot of political noise about doing something frightening for us to the Species at Risk Act. A previous government had engaged in a lot of work effectively dismantling every single important piece of environmental legislation that existed in the country. By about 2012, the only piece of legislation that remained was the Species at Risk Act. Something to know about the Species at Risk Act, which is Canada's version of the Endangered Species Act in the United States, is that we kind of know in rough terms, sometimes very specifically, sometimes a little bit generally, about why species decline. We have that information in most instances. It's not usually all that hard to figure out. We know also that if we want to recover those species, that can be a very difficult thing to do because there are some key limitations in terms of things like habitat availability. How much space is there that those organisms need to actually expand their populations and recover from the brink of extinction? So there are certain, kind of bodies of scientific information that are quite well understood in the context of what causes species at risk to become at risk and how we can recover them. But the Species at Risk Act is also interesting as a piece of legislation because it specifically requires that decision-making under its auspices be informed by evidence. This is neat. And so this is a theme that I really want everybody to take notice of, and that is that challenges to scientific integrity have been accompanied in every single instance in Canada and the United States by systemic attacks on environmental protections, or even just sensible environmental management. Not just, we're not all, hugging trees and creating vast national parks. Even just the trivial things of trying to control emissions of deadly pollutants, has been undermined in some instances. So at the time, the Harper government had effectively obliterated the environmental legislative kind of web that was intended to protect environments across Canada. They had refused to enforce existing laws, and accompanying this was muzzling federal scientists in a way that basically prevented them from communicating to the public, except after a long and sometimes interminable bureaucratic process implemented inside line departments that was usually going to get in the way of effective media communication because the process would take too long for media deadlines to be ever met. Okay, so what we saw is by 2011, 2012, a whole lot of really public commentary by folks like the Minister of Environment at the time, Peter Kent, basically saying this is a rotten piece of legislation and we want to do all kinds of things to it. This created some challenges to us. They began to make a public case that on scientific grounds appeared to be divorced from reality. So scientists, few of us here in Ottawa, and then reaching out across the country, a nucleus of ecology people got together as purely in the scientific context and evaluated the evidence that we had been told by government representatives that was their argument for dismantling the Species at Risk Act. And the result of this work was the identification of some of the key principles that emerged from scientific information that stood in stark contrast with the public communication that we had received from government at the time. And we evaluated this very carefully. It was peer reviewed, and then it was made kind of a hybrid public-private to scientists across the country. So everybody who had a PhD or advanced degrees in ecology or evolution or conservation was made aware of this letter. And we ended up with about more than 1,000 signatories to it, pointing out that the problems with the Species at Risk Act arose because of failures to use the Act, not primarily problems with the Species at Risk Act itself. This was important. So what it managed to do was identify a scientific consensus that SARA was because of poor implementation or uneven implementation, not because of the counter arguments that it was somehow just a bad law in some fundamental ways. The existence of this letter wasn't leaked to PMO, really. It's probably not the right term here. We communicated it directly to people inside the Prime Minister's office, and some of our people met with the person on point for environmental issues in the PMO, and they summarized the information in the letter privately to that person. Basically, the gist of it was, if the legislation was going to be changed, it would be against the advice of the nation's scientists. The upshot of all of this, and there was a great deal more to this story that I couldn't possibly get into here, but I've published a book chapter on this last year that I would be very happy, filled with references that I'd be very happy to share with anyone who would like to see a copy. The revisions were shelved, and what was made clear to us is that they would have been revisited early in a subsequent mandate had that government been reelected. This is an example where scientists speaking in defense of evidence actually exerted a benefit in terms of protecting what remained of the web of environmental legislation in Canada. But this was by no means the only thing going on at the time. And as I mentioned before, the links between attacks on environmental protections and attacks on scientific integrity have always gone hand in hand. So there were many assaults on democratic norms during that time. Harper muzzled scientists and suppressed evidence in lots of ways, as well as taking steps to fire literally thousands of people from the kind of research and science side of the public service. We had spoken behind the scenes as quietly and diplomatically as possible to speak about the value of scientific integrity and its public interest and importance. But this was met uniformly with either active disdain when meeting in person, but sometimes with some rather vicious personal and public attacks. And I was among many people speaking about these things and was attacked literally on live radio on CBC by a minister of the Crown. And fortunately, that worked out, I think, rather better for me than it did for the minister at the time. But it's one of those examples of things that just shouldn't happen, that politicians are attacking individuals speaking up in defense of the fact that evidence matters when making decisions. By about 2011, many of us in the community had chose to stand up and to speak out. This is a weird thing for scientists to do. We are not normally or comfortable with engaging with society in this kind of context. Instead, we have often felt that we should stand by society and offer the work that we do rather than speaking out in defense of these fundamental things like that evidence matters when you make decisions. And I'm very proud to say that in 2011, it was my scientific society, the Canadian Society for Ecology and Evolution, that led this work and was at the heart of the formation of Evidence for Democracy, which was kind of, as well as the evidence, the Death of Evidence rally, which was thought up in a pub on Laurier Street. Many of you probably know it, the Royal Oak, memorable for a bunch of things. So one of the things that we had to do as scientists was, in addition to doing our own work, in addition to speaking to people in calm, cool, and collected ways, we also had to go out in front of the public. And this is from the Stand Up for Science rally in 2012, I think it was. And this is me speaking very, looking like I'm all angry. But these tub-thumping speeches are interesting as a scientist because they can also create risks to scientific integrity. What often is heard when you give a speech of this kind is the tone rather than the content. But I focused a lot on the content before I started thinking about the tone. And when I give speeches like this, and fortunately I haven't had to do one in a very long time, but when I give speeches like this as a scientist, what I do is I look at the content of that speech and I ask whether it could be subjected to peer review. Am I saying things that are factually true, or am I saying things where I'm sliding over the line into a risky zone in terms of my scientific integrity? And what I decided was that for me, my choice was going to be everything I say has to be able to pass the peer review litmus test. And after that, it's kind of theatrics and rhetoric, but the basic facts all had to be as correct as I could make them. Now, scientists at this time, of course, were by no means the only people who were beginning to notice that we were losing some characteristics from what I would think of as good governance. Among the champions for evidence as well as for environmental issues, I don't think anybody stood forth more powerfully than Dr. Kirsty Duncan. She had spoken out on these things in various ways and was doing so before the rest of us really edged out into the public sphere. in Parliament and in editorials and in speeches. So a lot of this work was also happening in parallel and independently of us. And by no means do I want to try to suggest that scientists created this whole counter thinking to the attacks on integrity and evidence-based decision-making. But one of the things that was really important from my point of view was to identify who those champions were and what we could do to support those champions and maybe to amplify the messages that they were bringing. And I was very happy to have a chance to work with Dr. Kirsty Duncan. And we worked out an approach that could improve evidence-based decision-making and begin to recover scientific integrity in future governments. What we actually were aiming for was that government, but in the end, it worked out to be future governments. So then, we did quite a lot of work together, and it was uniformly really successful and positive. And there's a whole lot of things that happened that I'm not going to talk about here, but at the end of a lot of work with Dr. Duncan, we had a motion to Parliament that was debated in 2015. This was the last meaningful action in Parliament before the 2015 election. And this motion had three principles that I particularly cared about in crafting the language of that motion. The first was we had to unmuzzle scientists. Scientists should be free to speak about their scientific research, except under carefully prescribed circumstances when, for example, we're not going to have defense scientists go out and speak publicly about their research on new radar technologies. This is not a sensible thing to do, or on matters before the courts, that kind of thing. So there are sensible exceptions, but the message should be that it is routinely possible, not that it is routinely impossible. The second thing was that we, this is based on my own background working with the chief science advisor in the United Kingdom during my postdoc, we wanted to restore and create a more powerful office of the chief scientific advisor. There was a lot of discussion about this. The motion included slightly different language. It was officer, not advisor, but we were quite stridently in favor of advisor, not officer. And finally, we wanted to enable public communication and availability of scientific information that the government had collected. At the time, the Conservatives voted uniformly against it. They had a majority. The motion was defeated quite soundly, and this helped the cause quite a lot. Now, obviously, that what happened was that motion to Parliament that Dr. Duncan really was responsible for presenting and for crafting and was a powerful force behind in Parliament. That was converted to the science platform for her party in that year's election. And here we are a couple of years later, introducing Canada's first chief scientific advisor in this new form. Along with Dr. Duncan in the center, there's a whole bunch of, kind of very significant people in this photograph, Arthur MacDonald, Vicky Caspi, and of course, Dr. Mona Niemer, who is this first chief science advisor. So there's a great deal to be said about, scientific integrity and engagement with the public. We worked very, very hard on recovering scientific integrity in the public service. There are many forms in which that work made progress. But it's worth noting that in 2015, the very first cabinet meeting of the new government had two key things that emerged from that cabinet meeting, and they were both about evidence. The first thing was restoring the long-form census. And in parallel with that, so it's not really second, but the other thing was unmuzzling federal scientists. This was literally the first act of the majority government in 2015. And we were incredibly proud of the fact that we had made this progress. But here's the thing. You can say this, it can come from federal cabinet, it can be supported by the prime minister, it can be supported by the entire government. But the culture of the public service had changed, and it took years more work, taking many different forms, before we actually really nailed down the strong progress towards recovering scientific integrity that we have now seen. And I should say that that progress isn't perfect, that there is in some ways important work left to do, and we need to remain vigilant because all progress is provisional. And scientists need to know that policy doesn't work like science does. That is, when you have something that's really a strong theory in science, it's probably not ever going to be overturned. Policy doesn't work like that. And the next time somebody makes the mistake of thinking so, they should remind themselves of just how many things you can squeeze into an omnibus bill in a majority government. So I'd like to wrap up at this point and just say that scientists have often attempted to remain locked safely in their ivory towers away from society, away from the messy business of informing the policy process. But what I would say is that by doing so, scientists can eventually guarantee that they are viewed by society as a luxury that is not necessary. We need to engage with society in part because we need to acknowledge with gratitude that society supports our work. Moreover, and this is critical from my point of view, science is not optional in the policy process. Now, of course, some policies don't draw heavily on science, but many do. And if scientists choose to absent themselves from those conversations, they don't really have the right to complain about how the policy didn't turn out how they wished it did later on. In any event, when scientific integrity is under attack, when it is being suppressed, miscommunicated, or even falsified, and we've seen all three of those things happen, it rose to the level of an art form with the Trump people in the United States. If scientists are not going to stand up and defend science, it's not clear who will. Nobody is better equipped to discuss why science matters than the people who do that job themselves. Engaging with policy is not something that should make us afraid as scientists. Policy engagement does not intrinsically compromise integrity, but it's really important for us when we operate as scientists in that arena to be aware of what the risks are and to ensure that we are always doing our best, however imperfect that may prove to be, because we are all human. We need to be highly cognizant of what we're actually doing versus what we are aspiring to be doing. That means we need to be engaging in honest signaling about our work in the public arena. I'd like to also remind everybody that attacks on environmental policy have been long inextricably linked with attacks on scientific integrity. These two things do not map in a one-to-one way on each other, but when scientific integrity is being undermined, you don't have to look very far to find environmental attacks also happening. But the good news in all of this, and again, purely from my point of view as somebody long in the trenches with this and working with powerful champions to make a difference, is that both environmental protections, which is really just a way of saying not disregarding environments when the economy is the focus, it is possible to recover environmental protections, and it is possible to recover scientific integrity. And both of these things have, in some key respects, been recovered here, as well as increasingly in the United States, after, frankly, 4 very dark years of deeply bizarre governance in that our closest democracy. And I'd just like to conclude for the day, once again, with thanks to the ISSP and especially the rather inspired leader, Monica Gattinger, who I think has just been wonderful in her role. Genevieve Dunn has done a lot of work to help us in today's presentation. And an evidence hero of mine, Margaret McQuaig Johnston. It's a pleasure to work with all of you. This lion, it's a photograph I took in the Serengeti a few years ago, is here to remind us that however, we may feel we have made progress in terms of the work that we personally may care about, that constant vigilance is required and defense of those principles, because you never know what the future will bring. And with that, I will conclude, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. And, it feels like a long time since we lived through those traumatic years, and you've really brought back experiences that for many of us were quite visceral in how we responded to the demise, really, over 10 dark years of what a lot of us had built in terms of the credibility of science. And so thank you for those reminders. I myself look back to one of the ones that really hit the public, which was the experimental lakes area.
Yes.
And this was not just Canadian science. This was science that was used internationally.
Global,
and to really kill it for no apparent reason was a tragedy. And something like that, it's very hard to come back to rebuild it, because then there's a big block of years where you don't have the data, and you need continuing data year over year to come to the conclusions that are necessary to determine what evidence you're going to use. So I don't know if you want to say a few words about that. That's something that I know you have been involved in.
Yeah, I was a little bit, and I would not like to stand in front of the people who are the real champions as far as that goes. But I was engaged with that, and I spoke about it, wrote about it a little bit in the chapter that I had previously mentioned that I'd be more than happy to share with people. There's a lot to be said about the experimental lakes area, but I'd just like to amplify a single point that you mentioned, because everything you said about ELA was just exactly correct. But there's one point in there that was a very cross-cutting issue for us, starting around about 2011, when the lights started going out in terms of data collection. The gaps between one time and another time, when you try to flick the lights back on again, that gap can conceal a lot of mischief. One of the things that I was very happy to be able to engage in an evidence-based way with the honorable, at the time, the Minister of Science, Dr. Duncan, was in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. One of the things that happened, and speaking to the point that you raised, is that the previous government had shut down part of the census which measured what was going on in academic institutions. Now, there was just no reason for this. The amount of money that was saved was utterly trivial. This was not the long form census. This was like a really small thing that was really important, because it measured how progress was going in terms of representation of underrepresented groups in the academy. So they just shut that down. And what that meant was we had to find all kinds of surrogate sources of information that were highly imperfect to try to understand just how much damage we had accumulated as an academic community across the country over those period of years. And that was troubling in a very profound way. And again, that was another thing I was not involved with at all, was the recovery of what's called the UCAS survey. That was something that the minister reinstated, precisely because you can't solve problems if you don't know what the facts are. And reinstating UCAS was intended to allow us to measure progress towards true inclusion in the academy.
Thank you for that. I remind the viewers that you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we have a number of them coming in. One relates to the role that you had speaking as a scientist versus speaking with a lot of other scientists together, and what of those are most effective. And then there's a related question about the media and how the media receive the message of the scientists. And can you say something about that?
I'd be happy to. And I would just say that, you know, anything that I say now is really from my personal experience. And the answers that I give you will be answers that are true for me, but different people will have different experiences. And, you know, I think when doing this work, one of the things that I would say in response is it's a good idea to play to your strengths, you know, and try to work on the things that you feel weakest about. So what I found in terms of working with scientists was that I did not have to, it was not hard to convince people that we were facing grave problems. I didn't really have to do any convincing at all. They all kind of got that. And the science community, I thought, was pretty responsive to the idea that engaging more would be a good idea. There was a fair bit of pushback among some senior scientists about that I think had to do with their comfort about showing up in a way that might be seen as partisan when all they were actually doing was saying reality matters when making policy. I mean, that was what we were really arguing. Please take account of reality when making policy. Don't pretend that the climate isn't changing the next time you make a policy, for example. The science community was pretty receptive overall, with some notable exceptions. People who were not comfortable in terms of engaging with the public did not do so. But the science community came together fairly quickly, and it was one of the reasons why evidence for democracy kind of really snowballed into a real force over the course of 2011 to 2015 or so, as it was growing. But the other part was to do with the media. The media, I found, was always very interested to talk about this stuff. I got attacked a few times in the National Post, but I always view that as sort of a badge of honor. So, when you get people writing editorials complaining about something you did, it means you're probably making a difference. And that I always took as a good sign. If, Terence Corcoran or something was going off about how all those scientists ought to just shut up and take the money and go home, blah, blah, blah. That to me is a sign that we're doing something right. But those were also very unusual sorts of bozo eruptions, frankly. And what we were dealing with mostly was the professional media, who actually cared about having a thoughtful discussion about the role of evidence in decision making. And so CBC or the major papers, Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, they were all thinking carefully about this, not necessarily taking our side, but allowing us to speak and presenting an intelligent discussion if it was a two-sided discussion at all, which often it actually wasn't. But in any event, journalists I found to be a very good group of people on the whole to deal with. But the folks who really disagreed with us never actually talked to any of us. They stayed away. And I thought that was a telling form of pseudo-journalism. But there's a huge amount of this stuff's on the public record, and people can easily.
Right. So there are related questions related to what were the reasons that the Harper government gave to voting against the 2015 motion, and then how can the community, the scientific or technical community, better communicate with parliamentarians and ministers of the government to sell science-based facts and views, is the way that this viewer has put it.
Okay, and I think that's actually a really important issue, and I'm very concerned about appearing to be a real partisan here, when in fact, contrary to appearances, I'm really not. Okay, so here's just the simple fact of the matter in terms of that debate that happened in Parliament. I was in Parliament for most of it and was constantly texting with Dr. Duncan for the rest of it, and they said a lot of things that were just flat out untrue. in that discussion. Basically, they voted against it because the Liberals had put it forward. That's why they voted against it, and they didn't want to have to do anything that they had already been pasted by Parliament on a number of occasions in the past, and they hated it. It was bad PR, and they didn't want to lose a motion, especially going into an election. But in their arguments, they put forward a number of statements that were demonstrably false. I mean, just absolutely false. And so what they would say is that, no, there's no such thing as muzzling. It just doesn't happen. Scientists can speak with the media whenever they want, which is was just a flat out falsehood. And we could document, any number of examples. In my book chapter, I do this. Dr. Duncan has done it on any number of occasions publicly and in her writing. That this is just a bald-faced lie, to put, not a fine point on it at all, because it was clearly just lying through their teeth. But, they tried to put on a good show about this sort of thing. And, it was pretty brutal, but they were also in the end on the record as engaging in doublethink. And I mean that in the very specifically Orwellian sense. Now, the folks in government at that time were, I think, by and large, pretty smart people. Doublethink is knowing the truth but believing the lie. So they stood forward and advocated. I mean, I'm not sure if they believed the lie, because I don't know that they did, but they put forward a case which required everybody else to engage in doublethink, which is the ultimate Orwellian thing, that, basically people believe whatever the authorities tell them to believe. Right. And so now, we know the truth because we can look at the facts, but here we are hearing the Prime Minister and the Minister of State for Science saying things that are demonstrably false. Who do we believe? And ultimately the objective there was to get us to believe the lie. Then that is doublethink. And that sort of Orwellian approach here, massively problematic. In terms of how we sell our message as scientists to the public, I think we have to be deeply humble about doing this. I think all of us as academics, we all engage in the twin vital missions of academics. And you'll notice that I don't mention administration in the twin vital messages, twin vital works, but teaching and research. So teaching, of course, reaches the public because it's the heart of education in universities. So you reach a huge number of people that way, and that's a constant source of good in society from my point of view. A better informed society is a more capable and just society. But we as individuals, research is part of this too, but we as individuals can also step out of the ivory tower in various ways. One example of this would be citizen science. I'm going to be testifying to Parliament in about 2 weeks on this, to the SRSR committee. We're going to be talking about citizen science and ways in which it can reach people that our traditional mechanisms do not. And for anybody who has ever been out bird watching, you're probably familiar with the app called eBird. This is a source of vast amounts of scientific data that's used for discovery research, but which also reaches millions of people around the world. And that's one example of ways in which we can get out there. Others, popular writing, speaking to classrooms of kids, speaking at public meetings and in city-sponsored events. There are lots of ways that scientists can get out into the world and make their voice heard, but also hear the voices of people outside the ivory tower and engage in a true conversation. The last thing I'd just say about this is that scientists need to be part of a conversation. What that means, what that implies, is that 50% of the time should be spent listening.
Good, very good point. Regrettably, we've got several other questions we haven't had time to get to, but I'll pass them on to you after, Jeremy.
Be very happy to respond to those.
Now I'd like to pass it off to Jennifer Dunn, Genevieve Dunn in ISSP.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So just a couple closing remarks on my end. I want to start by thanking Jeremy and Margaret for your time today and for this really fascinating conversation. And I'd also like to thank our audience members for joining us on their lunch hour and for submitting some really great questions. If you guys enjoyed this event and you're interested in participating in more discussions that explore the links and facets of science, society, and policy, we invite you to look into some of the events that I've shared in the chat. The ISSP is hosting a panel on cybersecurity co-organized with RCIS on February 15th. And then our next Food for Thought is taking place on February 23rd, featuring Professor Karen Hinzer to discuss advances in research and training in solar power and photonics power conversions. So again, thank you all for your time this afternoon, and we hope to see you at the next event.